Take a good, long look at this thick, jet black, industrial looking paste. It's famously, almost aggressively salty. To the uninitiated, the smell is challenging, somewhere between strong soy sauce and the floor of a brewery. And its taste has launched an entire genre of online video. A digital library thousands of clips long, all with the same basic plot. A confident tourist, a tiny spoonful, and a facial expression that cycles through confusion, betrayal, and pure, unadulterated shock. The reaction is almost always the same: spitting, gagging, and a desperate search for water. By all rational measures of modern food, this product should not be a global icon. It should be a niche, regional condiment at best, something sold in a specialty shop, not an Aussie classic. And yet, this little yellow jar is, without question, the single most potent, most recognized, and most beloved symbol of an entire nation. It's probably the most Aussie food there is. This is Vegemite. How did this specific, challenging, divisive black paste conquer an entire continent? How did it weave itself so deeply into the fabric of a nation that it became a cultural shorthand? A symbol of identity. To find the origin of Vegemite, you have to rewind the clock to the early 1900s. Australia, as a newly federated country, was still finding its feet. Culturally, it was almost entirely tethered to Great Britain. Australians looked to Mother England for everything, for fashion, for literature, for politics, and especially for what they ate. The undisputed champion of the breakfast table was a British invention called Marmite. It was, just like its future cousin, a dark, sticky, savory yeast extract, itself a clever byproduct of the beer brewing industry. It was nutritious, it was salty, and Australians had grown up with it. It was a familiar taste of home, even if home was thousands and thousands of kilometers away. Then, in 1914, the world exploded. The outbreak of World War I completely shattered the global supply chains that the British Empire relied on. Those reliable merchant ships bringing staples like Marmite from London to Melbourne were suddenly either at the bottom of the Atlantic, thanks to German U-boats, or had been requisitioned for the war effort. As the war dragged on, imports of Marmite slowed to a trickle, and then they virtually stopped. Australia was facing a breakfast crisis, a severe, and for many, a traumatic Marmite shortage. This left a gaping yeast extract-shaped hole in the Australian market. This is where a man named Fred Walker enters the story. Walker was a visionary in the fledgling Australian food industry. He'd built Fred Walker & Co. by canning foods and processing cheese. Walker saw the Marmite shortage as a golden opportunity. He had the factories, he had the distribution network, and he had the ambition. All he needed was a world-class product. He turned to Cyril Callister, who immediately got to work. He sourced the raw ingredient easily enough. Tons and tons of leftover brewer's yeast. A vitamin-rich sludge that the local Carlton and United Brewery was literally just dumping as industrial waste. But Callister knew you couldn't just bottle the sludge. It was bitter and unpalatable. He had to invent a process. He spent months, some say years, in his laboratory, experimenting with a complex biochemical process called autolysis. This involved using the yeast's own enzymes to break down the yeast cells, effectively liquefying their nutritious, flavor-packed contents. He then had to meticulously wash, filter, and concentrate this extract, carefully separating the tasty, savory core from the bitter dregs. It was painstaking, scientific work. After countless trials, he landed on a final formula, blending his refined black extract with a top-secret and carefully balanced mix of salt, celery, and onion extracts. The result was a thick black paste. It was intensely savory, packed with a natural umami flavor, and, as it would turn out, one of the most nutritionally dense foods on the planet. In 1923, Fred Walker was finally ready to sell his creation. He was a marketing man, so he launched a national competition with a hefty £50 prize to find a name. The 1920s were an era of science and modernity, and the winning name chosen by Walker's daughter, Sheila, was perfect: Vegemite. But the launch was an absolute flop. Vegemite was a financial black hole for Fred Walker. It turns out the product had two massive, insurmountable problems. First, the war was long over, and the original beloved British Marmite was now back on the shelves in full force. Australian consumers, creatures of habit and still deeply loyal to the crown, went right back to their old favourite without a second thought. Second, the name Vegemite meant nothing. People didn't know what it was. Was it made from vegetables? Was it some kind of glue? Retailers complained that jars were just sitting on shelves collecting dust, and eventually they started returning them. Fred Walker started to become desperate. He'd invested a fortune into this product, and he became convinced that the name was the problem. So, in 1928, in one of the most baffling decisions in marketing history, he scrapped the Vegemite name entirely and held another national competition. The new name he chose was Parwill. What does Parwill even mean? The new advertising slogan, which was plastered on billboards and in newspapers, was, "If Marmite, then Parwill." The joke, if you can even call it that, was a convoluted grammatical nightmare. It was confusing and corny. Unsurprisingly, nobody understood the convoluted joke, and the slogan was openly mocked, and the meaningless Parwill name was ridiculed by a baffled public. After a few humiliating years, a defeated Fred Walker pulled Parwill from the shelves and, with his tail between his legs, quietly brought back the original Vegemite name. The brand was on life support. By all rational metrics, Vegemite should have died right there in the early 1930s, a forgotten footnote of a failed business venture. Around this same time in the 1930s, the world was becoming fascinated with a brand new, revolutionary concept: vitamins. It was cutting-edge science. The idea that these invisible, microscopic compounds in food were absolutely essential for life. Scientists were linking a lack of vitamins to diseases like scurvy, rickets, and beriberi. It just so happened that Dr. Cyril Callister's black paste, the one nobody wanted to buy, was a nutritional bomb. It was naturally, unbelievably stuffed with B group vitamins, like thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin, all things that were often lacking in the average diet of the day. The company stopped trying to compete on taste and started advertising in medical journals. They targeted doctors, nurses, and baby health clinics. And it worked. Doctors, seeing the hard nutritional data, began recommending Vegemite to patients. The real jackpot, the moment that changed everything, came in 1939. After a period of rigorous testing and scientific evaluation, the British Medical Association, which at the time was the absolute, unquestioned pinnacle of medical authority in the entire British Empire, gave Vegemite its official endorsement. Almost immediately, Vegemite was being prescribed to new mothers in hospitals to aid in recovery. It was given to patients on hospital food trays, and it was heavily promoted as an essential part of a child's daily diet for healthy development. This new reputation as a health food was about to be solidified in the most dramatic way possible. Because just as the BMA endorsement landed, the world exploded again. When World War II broke out, the Australian military, just like the doctors, recognized Vegemite's immense value. It was extraordinarily nutritious, it was calorie dense, it was incredibly lightweight, and it was shelf stable for years without refrigeration. It was, in short, the perfect military ration. The armed forces began buying Vegemite in massive, unprecedented quantities. It was packed into the ration kits for every single Australian soldier, sailor, and airman. This wartime role had two profound and lasting effects on the Australian psyche. First, an entire generation of Australian men spent the war years, from the deserts of Tobruk to the jungles of New Guinea, subsisting on Vegemite. It was a source of vital energy and vitamins in the most hellish conditions. And it was a powerful, savoury taste of home, a psychological comfort. Letters from the front line would specifically mention it. Second, Because the military had first priority on all production, Vegemite became incredibly scarce for civilians back home. And, as is always the case, scarcity creates demand. It became a patriotic act for civilians to go without Vegemite so that the boys overseas could have it. A Vegemite-less generation of children grew up wanting it, seeing it as a special treat and a symbol of the war effort. By the time the war ended in 1945 and the troops returned, Vegemite was completely transformed. It was no longer a failed condiment. It was a war hero, a symbol of survival, of patriotism, and of Australian resourcefulness. The soldiers who ate it in the jungles now came home and, as fathers, fed it to their children. The health food angle stuck, and Vegemite on toast became the standard issue Australian breakfast. Vegemite's rise from a failed, mocked joke to a cherished national treasure seemed complete. It was the ultimate all-Australian success story. Or was it? While Vegemite was becoming an icon, something was happening behind the scenes, a change that had actually started decades earlier. Remember back in the 1920s, when Vegemite and Parwill were failing so badly? Well, Fred Walker had partnered with a large, ambitious American company to get the exclusive and very lucrative rights to manufacture their newfangled processed cheese in Australia. That American company was Kraft. This deal was Vegemite's lifeline. For years, the steady, handsome profits from selling Kraft processed cheese were the only thing keeping the lights on at Fred Walker & Co., and the only thing allowing Walker to keep pouring money into his failing pet project. But Fred Walker had passed away back in 1935. Over the following years, that American partnership slowly and quietly evolved. Kraft's stake in the company grew larger and larger, and then, by the early 1950s, the entire Fred Walker & Co., including its new star product, Vegemite, was fully and formally acquired by the American giant Kraft Foods. At the very moment Vegemite was cementing its place as the ultimate Aussie icon, at the peak of its post-war popularity, it had become 100% American-owned. And here's the brilliant part. Kraft was smart. They were, for decades, the perfect custodians. They knew they had a golden goose, and their number one rule was, do not mess with the recipe. They didn't Americanize the product, and they ran the Australian operation as a local business. What they did do was pour their massive American budget and marketing genius into it. In 1954, to conquer the brand new and powerful medium of television, Kraft commissioned a jingle. It would become, without exaggeration, the most successful and most remembered advertisement in Australian history. Vegemite was no longer medicine prescribed to housewives or a war ration. It was a fun, cherished, non-negotiable part of childhood, and it was all funded by an American company. For over half a century, this was the secret status quo. Vegemite was Australian in its heart, its soul, and its taste, but it was American on its balance sheet. And for the most part, Australians either didn't know or simply didn't care, as long as nothing changed. Until, in 2009, the American owners made one colossal nation-uniting mistake. By the late 2000s, Kraft's global marketing department, now full of 21st century thinkers, got an itch. They looked at the Vegemite brand, a reliable but stagnant cash cow, and felt it needed to be innovated for a new generation. Young people were eating new things for breakfast, and Kraft wanted to leverage the brand equity, whatever that means. Their big idea was to launch a new product, a premixed blend of Vegemite and cream cheese designed to be smoother, milder, and less challenging for younger palates. To build hype, they launched a massive Name This Product competition, inviting Australians to name the new spread. But the name they ultimately unveiled to the world, the one chosen by their marketing experts, was so profoundly, hilariously terrible that the entire country recoiled in unison. They called it iSnack 2.0. It sounded like a parody of a bad tech startup. More importantly, it sounded like a name cooked up by a committee of completely out-of-touch executives in a Chicago boardroom who had never even tasted Vegemite let alone understood what it meant. The move was perceived as a deep cultural insult, far worse than a simple marketing mistake. The Australian public, now armed with the new power of social media, erupted in one of the first major digital backlashes in the country's history. The true impact of the iSnack 2.0 saga went far beyond the failure of a single product. It effectively ripped the mask off the brand's ownership, becoming a jarring public moment of realization as the entire country was forced to confront the fact that their national icon was not in fact theirs. It was viewed as definitive proof that the foreign owners, despite 50 years of otherwise smart stewardship, fundamentally didn't get it. Kraft panicked, and within days, they announced they were scrapping the name. The product was quickly and boringly renamed to Vegemite Cheesy Bite, but the damage was done. The corporate structure only got more complicated. In 2012, Kraft itself was split into two separate companies. The international snacks division, which included Vegemite, was spun off into a new, faceless global entity called Mondelez International. This just added another layer of separation, making Vegemite feel even more distant from its Australian roots. This uneasy situation simmered for 5 more years, and then, in January 2017, the news that many had been waiting for finally broke. An Australian company, the Debacle Group, itself an iconic brand best known for its cheese, had struck a deal with Mondelez. For $460 million, Debacle was acquiring Vegemite along with the original Port Melbourne factory where it had always been made and a portfolio of other products. After decades under American control, Vegemite was finally 100% Australian owned. Debacle Group understood exactly what it had bought. They recognized that in acquiring the factory and the recipe, they had also taken on the immense responsibility of becoming the official stewards of a national symbol. Today, that little jar is more powerful than ever. It's still the quintessential Aussie food test given to visiting relatives and new immigrants, serving as a cultural bridge for so many communities. That divisive, love it or hate it nature is, in fact, central to its identity. Australians are fiercely proud of its unique and challenging character. The story of Vegemite is, in so many ways, the story of Australia itself. It was born from a desire to be independent, but it struggled to find its footing. It was saved from obscurity by science and sacrifice, and then catapulted to fame by global forces. It spent a long time as a foreign asset, but in the end, it was brought back home, reclaimed by its people, not just as a product, but as a piece of the national soul. But what do you think? Was Vegemite's American ownership a strange betrayal of a national icon? Or was Kraft's marketing muscle the very thing that made it the icon it is today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and if you enjoyed this salty, savory breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.